A video was never supposed to get out. Whatever was happening behind those closed doors in Berea was meant to stay there, carefully managed, quietly controlled, and fed to the public on the Browns' own timeline. But footage has a way of finding the light, and when this one did, it didn't just leak, it detonated. Because what it showed wasn't a quarterback competition, it showed a coronation that the Cleveland Browns had already decided on long before a single training camp rep was ever taken. Shedeur Sanders is QB1. The building knows it. Todd Monken knows it. And now, thanks to a video that nobody in that organization wanted you to see, the entire football world knows it too. The question isn't whether Shedeur has earned this anymore. The question is why it took this long for Cleveland to stop pretending otherwise, and what it says about everyone who spent months telling you something different. This wasn't supposed to go public. That's the part that makes this story so much bigger than just a quarterback decision. Front offices leak things on purpose all the time. Controlled narratives, timed announcements, carefully placed quotes from anonymous sources. That's the machine. That's how the NFL manages its own story. But this footage wasn't planted. It wasn't a strategic rollout designed to build hype heading into camp. It got out because the truth inside that building had grown too big to contain. And once it started spreading online, there was nothing Cleveland's PR operation could do to walk it back. The reaction was immediate. Fans who had spent months being told this was a genuine competition watched that video and felt something they hadn't felt in a long time: validation. Because what they saw wasn't a quarterback trying to earn a job. What they saw was a quarterback already running one. And the coaches around him weren't watching with uncertainty, they were watching with recognition. Todd Monken did not fly to Cleveland to manage a quarterback battle. Coaching staffs at this level do not operate on open-ended timelines when the answer is already obvious. Every coordinated install session, every route concept walkthrough, every red zone script that Shedeur Sanders has been handed this offseason has been handed to him because the people designing this offense already know who they're designing it for. The so-called competition was never the story. The story was all about how long Cleveland could maintain the illusion before the walls came down. And the walls came down hard. When that footage started circulating, the illusion didn't just crack, it collapsed entirely. The Browns are not auditioning quarterbacks anymore. They are preparing one. But to understand why this moment hit the way it did, you have to go back several months and look at the move that started revealing the full picture long before any video ever surfaced. When the Cleveland Browns traded Myles Garrett to the Los Angeles Rams, the football world treated it as a blockbuster transaction. And in terms of pure talent leaving a roster, it absolutely was. Myles Garrett is a generational pass rusher. He is the kind of player franchises build their entire defensive identity around. The kind of player you do not move unless the calculus is fundamentally shifted at the organizational level. And that is exactly what happened. Because a team that genuinely believed it was competing for a playoff spot in the near future does not trade its most dominant defensive player for draft capital. You simply do not do that. You hold on to your best weapons when you believe the window is open. The fact that Cleveland moved Garrett when they did wasn't a salary decision or a relationship breakdown or any of the other surface-level explanations that got floated in the immediate aftermath. It was a declaration. It was the Browns organization standing in front of the entire NFL and admitting, without using those exact words, that the rebuild is real, the timeline has shifted, and 2027 is the target. That trade removed the last piece of the mask. Think about what the Browns have been quietly assembling over the past 2 years. Draft pick after draft pick stockpiled, roster flexibility prioritized over win-now moves, a coaching hire in Todd Monken that screams quarterback development rather than immediate contention. None of that is the behavior of a franchise trying to compete right now. All of it points in the same direction. And when you trade the best player on your defense to add even more premium ammunition to that arsenal, you are not doing it because you plan to rely on Deshaun Watson this fall. You are doing it because you need to be positioned to get the right player. And here is the part that makes the Garrett trade even more revealing in hindsight. Shedeur Sanders was already in the building. The front office had already seen what he could do, and they still made that trade. That tells you everything. Cleveland is not building toward next season. They are building toward a quarterback era. and the quarterback who is going to anchor that era is already on the roster, throwing in front of coaches who have stopped pretending to evaluate and started preparing to deploy. Which brings us to Deshaun Watson. And this part of the story requires honesty that the Cleveland media spent an entire offseason refusing to deliver. There was a version of this narrative where Watson's return made sense on paper, a former Pro Bowl quarterback, fully recovered, hungry to prove himself, stepping into a rebuilt situation with something to fight for. That version existed in press releases and optimistic column inches. It never existed in reality. Watson has not been a functional starting quarterback in years, not in any meaningful sense. The injury that derailed his last attempt wasn't just a setback in the normal sense, it fractured his entire developmental timeline and exposed something that many people in the league had quietly suspected for a while. The elite-level processing, the pocket management, the ability to dissect a defense at the speed the modern NFL demands, those things require continuity. They require reps and rhythm and the kind of sustained performance that builds on itself over time. Watson has had none of that, and what little he showed before the injury suggested that the version of him Cleveland paid for was already fading before it ever got a real chance to arrive. Calling him the favorite heading into this competition wasn't just wrong, it was an insult dressed up as analysis. Watson brought nothing into this situation that should have made Shedeur Sanders lose a single night's sleep. Not his experience, not his contract, not his name recognition, not the narrative around his return. None of it translated into on-field production that could hold up against what a younger, sharper, hungrier quarterback was showing every single day in practice. Sanders arrived and consistently outperformed him, not occasionally, consistently. And the people responsible for evaluating quarterbacks, not the reporters, not the television analysts, not the fans with opinions on social media, but the coaches whose careers depend on getting this right, noticed it from the beginning. Monken noticed it, the front office noticed it, and the longer the so-called competition dragged on, the more embarrassing it became that anyone in Cleveland's media was still writing about Deshaun Watson as though he had a real path to that starting job. The harsh truth about Watson's situation is this: the bar for him should have been dominance. He is a veteran quarterback with years of NFL experience, full organizational support, every resource available, and the benefit of an entire offseason to prepare. Against a rookie who had never taken a professional snap before this year, Deshaun Watson should have been untouchable from the day one. He should have walked onto that practice field and made the conversation irrelevant within the first week. He didn't. He couldn't separate himself from a first-year player learning a professional system for the first time in his life. That is not a Shedeur Sanders problem. That is a Watson collapse. When a veteran cannot outperform a rookie in straight evaluation, the veteran's window is not closing. It is already shut. Watson knew it, the coaches knew it, and the only people pretending otherwise were the ones still writing their columns from a narrative that had already expired. Now, here is something the Cleveland media got completely backwards, and it matters because it has been shaping the public perception of this competition in a way that is genuinely misleading.
Todd Monken was open about the fact that he changes his mind on this quarterback situation on a day-to-day basis. Every morning, apparently, the evaluation shifts, and every reporter covering this team took that admission and framed it as balance, as evidence that both quarterbacks are in a real fight, that Watson still has a legitimate shot, that Monken genuinely doesn't know who his starter is going to be. That reading is completely wrong. A head coach does not wake up every morning reconsidering his quarterback because two players are equal. Coaches reconsidering every day means one player keeps doing something that demands a second look. It means someone in that competition is generating plays that force the coaching staff to sit back and go through the tape again, to question assumptions they walked in with, to update their evaluation based on what they're actually seeing rather than what they expected to see. That is not Watson. Watson has not done anything worth looking at twice in years. The daily reconsideration that Monken described is Shedeur Sanders making himself impossible to ignore. Every time the coaching staff settles into a comfortable projection, Sanders goes out the next day and complicates it. That is not the behavior of a player who is behind. That is the behavior of a player who is winning. Monken had said publicly before training camp that he wanted his starting quarterback identified by June 11th. That deadline came and went with no announcement, and the Cleveland media covered the missed deadline as a negative, as a sign that the competition had stalled, that neither guy had stepped up, that Cleveland was stuck in uncertainty heading into camp. But think about what that missed deadline actually means when you examine it honestly. A head coach that walked into the offseason expecting to hand Watson the job quietly and move on, because that is exactly what Cleveland planned to do, could not make that announcement on time because a rookie quarterback kept showing up and making it impossible. Shedeur Sanders was not supposed to make this difficult. He was supposed to be a developmental project, sitting behind a veteran starter while the Browns figured out their 2027 plans. Instead, he forced a coaching staff to blow past their own self-imposed deadline because they couldn't justify the decision they originally intended to make. That is not a story about uncertainty. That is the best story this franchise has had in years. And what makes it even more remarkable is the environment Shedeur Sanders walked into when he arrived in Cleveland. This was not a welcoming situation. Let's be direct about that. Sanders did not arrive in a city that was excited to see him. He did not step into a locker room that was waiting to rally around him. He walked into a franchise that had spent years and an enormous amount of money in draft capital on a quarterback who delivered almost nothing in return, into a media environment that had already decided Watson deserved more chances, and into a fan base that, through no fault of their own, had been conditioned by years of disappointment to manage their expectations downward by default. The people covering this team did not want Shedeur to win this job, not because of anything personal, but because acknowledging that he was winning would have required them to admit that everything they had been writing for months was wrong. And that is a difficult thing to do publicly when you have spent that much time and credibility building the opposite narrative. So, Sanders walked into that hostility and did the one thing that makes hostility irrelevant. He performed every single day. Monken watched him run that huddle with a command that most veterans take years to develop. He watched him process defenses at a level that does not show up in any draft projection or pre-draft evaluation. He watched a 22-year-old quarterback arrive in the most complicated situation a young player could inherit and handle it with a maturity that made the coaching staff stop thinking of him as a project and start thinking of him as a solution. That transition from project to solution is the most important thing that happened in Cleveland this offseason, and it happened before a single training camp practice ever took place. By the time that leaked footage started circulating online, the internal decision wasn't being made, it had already been made. The video didn't change anything inside that building, it just finally told the outside world what the inside world had known for weeks.
The people who tried to dim Shedeur's light during this process should sit with that. Every article that pushed Watson as the clear favorite, every television segment that treated Sanders like a long shot, every carefully framed press conference summary that implied this competition was too close to call, all of it was written while the coaching staff was quietly reaching a conclusion in the opposite direction. The media did not fail by accident. They failed because they prioritized the comfortable story over the true one, and they kept prioritizing it long after the evidence stopped supporting it. Shedeur paid a price for that every time a dishonest headline dropped. He didn't complain about it. He didn't push back publicly. He went back to work. And that restraint, more than any single throw or rep, is what convinced the people in that building that this kid is built for this. But perhaps the most underrated part of this entire story is the role that Browns fans played, because they figured this out long before any reporter was willing to say it. These are not casual observers. Cleveland Browns fans have spent decades watching their franchise suffer through decisions that never made sense, investments that never paid off, in quarterback situations that always seemed to resolve in the most painful way possible. They have sat in those seats and bought those jerseys and given this team their loyalty through some of the most demoralizing stretches in NFL history. They watched the Watson deal get made, watched the price get paid, and watched the return on that investment amount to almost nothing. They are not naive about how this organization operates. They are not confused about what a real quarterback looks like versus what a quarterback in decline looks like. They know the difference. In the moment the first Shedeur Sanders practice highlights started making the rounds online, they knew. They didn't need a reporter to translate it for them. They didn't need a beat writer to contextualize what they were seeing through carefully chosen words pulled from a Todd Monken press conference. They watched the footage, they compared it to everything Watson had shown, and they made an honest evaluation. Their quarterback is Shedeur Sanders. They arrived at that conclusion faster than the professional journalists who were sitting in the same press conferences and watching the same practices, because the fans were willing to believe what their eyes were showing them, while the reporters were still protecting a narrative they had invested too much credibility in to walk away from cleanly. There's a reporter who was asked by fans on air which quarterback looked better in practice, and his response, rather than just answering the question, was to suggest fans don't fully grasp what's happening inside the facility. That is one of the most condescending things a sports reporter can say to a fan base. These people have been inside this misery longer than most of the reporters covering this team. They understand Cleveland Browns football in a way that no press credential can replicate. They were not asking for an explanation. They were asking for confirmation of something they had already figured out on their own. And the confirmation they needed wasn't going to come from a press conference. It came from a leaked video that the Browns front office never wanted them to see. So here is where everything stands as training camp approaches. And here is what happens next. The footage is out. The internal decision has been made. Monken is walking into training camp with a quarterback he believes in, not a quarterback he is evaluating, not a quarterback he is developing on the sideline, but a quarterback he is preparing to start. Shedeur Sanders is going to walk into those padded practices with something that Watson does not have and cannot manufacture: real momentum. Real momentum, the kind that comes from performing well enough, consistently enough, that even a coaching staff trying to stay neutral cannot maintain the balance anymore. That momentum is going to meet live reps and padded contact in the full speed of professional evaluation, and it is going to hold up. Because the skills that have made Shedeur Sanders impossible to ignore in controlled settings don't disappear under pressure. They tend to sharpen. Watson is going to arrive carrying a different weight entirely. Years of rust, a fan base that has moved on, a media that is supporting him more out of contractual habit than genuine belief, in the knowledge which Watson absolutely has, because professional quarterbacks always know that the organization he is suiting up for has already told him through its actions and its priorities and its decisions that the future they are building does not have him in it. That is a brutal thing to walk into a training camp with, and it will show, not in some dramatic moment or public breakdown, but in the daily accumulation of reps where one quarterback is operating with freedom and the other is operating with desperation. Those two things play out very differently over 6 weeks of training camp, and the coaches evaluating both players every single day will see the difference clearly, even if the final announcement takes time to come out officially.
Cleveland's front office needs to reckon with what almost happened here. They spent years and enormous resources on a quarterback who gave them almost nothing in return. They burned draft capital, they damaged the locker room environment, they dragged this city through embarrassment after embarrassment, defending a decision that was wrong almost from the moment it was made. And sitting right there through all of it, patient, prepared, developing, was a player who was always going to be the answer if the organization had the courage to look honestly at what they had. They didn't look honestly for a long time. They let Watson's contract and Watson's name and the sunk cost of that entire disastrous era cloud an evaluation that should have been straightforward. And a rookie quarterback had to force the issue himself through performance, through consistency, through daily excellence that made it impossible for the coaching staff to keep their eyes somewhere else before Cleveland finally made the call that should have been obvious months ago. Here is what the rest of the NFL should understand about what is happening in Cleveland right now. This is not just a quarterback competition that resolved itself in an unexpected direction.
This is a franchise at a genuine inflection point, a moment where years of poor decision-making are finally being corrected by the emergence of a player who refuses to wait for permission. Shedeur Sanders is not the story because of the leaked footage. The footage is just the most recent confirmation of a story that has been building since the moment he arrived. The story is a 22-year-old quarterback who walked into one of the most complicated situations in the NFL, with the media against him and the institutional momentum against him, and the weight of the worst quarterback investment in recent NFL history hanging over every single evaluation, and proceeded to outperform every expectation, challenge every assumption, and force an organization that was trying to manage him quietly into a corner where honesty was the only option left. How does Watson sleep knowing a rookie took everything he could not hold on to? How does the Cleveland media make eye contact with Shedeur Sanders after spending months treating him as a sideshow? And most importantly, how does this front office ever fully explain to the people who have supported this team through years of pain why it took a trade, a leak, a collapsed deadline, and a viral video for them to finally do right by the quarterback who had been earning it in front of them the entire time? Training camp is coming, the pads go on, the real evaluation begins, and when it ends, the result is going to look exactly like what that leaked footage already showed everyone who was paying attention. Shedeur Sanders is the Cleveland Browns quarterback. He was always going to be. The only thing that changed is that Cleveland can no longer pretend otherwise.